So yes, I, like Nadina, also work for the Fu Medical Centre. Actually, I have a background. I trained to be a dietitian and then later on studied epidemiology. And now I'm doing a PhD as part of this MooDFOOD project. And today I've mainly focused on the bidirectional link between obesity and depression. And today I'm going to talk about obesity and depressed mood in a multi-ethnic population. So there's quite a lot of evidence that obesity is related to the development of depression, particularly long-term obesity. But the question is it necessarily so for everybody? And in fact, some studies have found that there's this cohort of jolly fat people. So they can be a larger figure, but they have absolutely no depressive symptoms. So from this, you could well guess that maybe the relationship between obesity and depression is not the same for all ethnic groups, which has in fact been found in America. So in America, they have found that there's a stronger association among the white and Hispanic population between obesity and depression, but no relationship for the African Caribbean population or black people. So then this might lead us to the question, why? Why might we expect this? Well, there is one social cultural theory which says that depression is influenced by the social context surrounding people. And this is backed up by the evidence that depression is often triggered by external stress factors. So one example is that it's been found that children who experience trauma, so sexual mishandling, and that often go on to develop depression later in their life. So how might this be influenced by ethnicity? What role can it play? Well, different ethnic groups have differences between their preferred body shape. So black and Hispanic people are often a lot more satisfied with a larger figure, and sometimes it might be even preferred. Whereas we all know as white people, you're brought up in a culture of desiring a slim figure. All the models are slim, the dolls are slim. So this can lead or can extra stresses. And that can happen in two ways. First is by having a greater body dissatisfaction, which leads to lower self-esteem, and lower self-esteem can develop into depression. And the alternative manner in which cultural body preferences can affect you is that people with a larger body shape may experience more weight stigmatization. But there's been some records collected in America, and they found that in the black population, they seem to experience less weight discrimination in things like applying for a job or something compared to white people. There's also another mechanism that might explain the differences between ethnic groups in their relationship between depression and obesity, and that's in coping mechanisms. So in a disadvantaged society or neighbourhood, people turn to coping mechanisms to help alleviate the stresses of everyday life. These coping mechanisms usually involve unhealthy behaviour, so smoking, alcohol use, less physical activity, and the consumption of obesogenic foods. And all of these factors will quite likely lead to gaining weight. So then the theory is that for black people or the African American groups, these coping mechanisms actually help alleviate mental stress, but of course at the cost of physical health. But in the white population, some study has shown that the relationship between stress and depression is actually greater in those who exhibit these unhealthy behaviours. Now, as well as these psychosocial mechanisms, there are also some biological mechanisms that explain the relationship between obesity and depression. And Adina has mentioned some of these, and part of this is due to the adipose tissue, which makes more more metabolic disturbances, and these metabolic disturbances are shown to influence mood and depression. And examples of these are a deregulated hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axes, and then also leptin resistance and systemic inflammation. Now, I haven't particularly found any literature that says that these things are different between ethnic groups, with the exception of the last one. And there is one paper that has found that the relationship between C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, is different in different ethnic groups, and the relationship between that and depression is different. However, there's also papers that say there's no difference between ethnic groups in the amount of inflammation they have and their depression. So this takes me on to my research question. Now, as you've seen, all of these studies have been carried out in America with white, black, or African American, as they like to call them, Hispanic populations, but nothing has been carried out in Europe. So my research question was to look at the relationship between obesity and depression, and to see whether this differed between 6 different European ethnic groups. And I also wanted to investigate how independent this was of lifestyle factors, health factors, and inflammation. And I used C-reactive protein as a marker of inflammation. So in order to do this study, I used something called the Helius study, which was performed in Amsterdam in 2002. And they collected data on 22,617 people aged between 18 and 70 years, with a mean age of 44 years. Now, this data set, they expressly included people of different ethnic minorities, either first or second generation. And these ethnic minorities include Dutch, South Asian Surinamese, African Surinamese, Ghanaian, Turkish, and Moroccan people. And all of these are quite typical ethnic minorities in the Netherlands. So in order to do my research, my outcome was depressed mood. This was measured with a score called the PHQ-9 score, which ranges from 0 to 27, and I used a cutoff of greater than 10 or greater to define people having depressed mood. And then my independent variable was body, a measure of obesity, and I had 2 measures of obesity. I had body mass index, which was divided into normal, overweight, and obese, and I excluded those who were underweight because it was a very small group. And then I also had waist circumference, which I divided up into quartiles. And then I made 4 separate models, and in the first model, I adjusted for gender, age, and number of years education. And then in the second model, I added alcohol use, smoking, physical activity. And in the third model, I added the number of chronic diseases. And in the final model, I added the inflammation marker, C-reactive protein, although this was only done in a smaller subset. So if we turn to the baseline descriptive characteristics, you can see that the prevalence of obesity is not evenly distributed across the 6 groups, with African, Surinamese, Ghanaian, Turkish, and Moroccan all being much more obese, higher prevalence of obesity, around 30 or more, compared to the Dutch population, where only 10% of the population was obese. Then looking at the depressive symptoms, or having depressed mood, this also was much higher in the Turkish and Moroccan group, and particularly low in the Dutch group, at only 7%. Now, the first analysis I did was to look at the overall relationship between obesity measures and depression, or depressed mood. And we can see from this that, as expected, being obese is significantly related to having a depressed mood. And also the highest 2 waist circumference quartiles are significantly related to having a depressed mood. Oh, gone too far. So this is just a quick table to show what the interaction terms are, which was how I tested whether there was a difference between ethnic groups. So we can see for the body mass index, these are p-values for the overall interaction term. So the ones that are in bold indicate that there was a significant effect modification by ethnicity. So for BMI, this is only evident in the first model, but for the waist circumferences, it was evident in all three, or the first three models. So our conclusion was there is some difference between these 6 ethnic groups, so we'll stratify the data so that you can see how the differences look, which I've done in this figure. So this figure is displaying the relationship between obesity measures and depression for the 6 ethnic groups. And then on the left-hand side, we have being obese versus not being obese. And on the right-hand side, we have the highest waist circumference versus not having the highest waist circumference. So there's a lot of information in this table, so I'll take you through it totally. And then we have the 3 models. The first model included the age, sex, and education. And the second model, I also included the alcohol, smoking, and physical activity. And in this third model, I also included the number of chronic diseases. Then these are all odds ratios. So the further to the right the lines are, the greater the association between obesity and depressed mood. And if the lines are totally to the right beyond the grey dotted line, that means it's a significant association. So then the most notable thing from this table or figure is that the Dutch population who are overweight or have a higher waist circumference all have a significant relationship between their weight and depressed mood, which is given by the orange blobs, so these ones. And then this is also true for the African Surinamese. For all our analysis, they always had a significant relationship between having a high waist circumference or being obese and having depressed mood. However, for the Turkish, Moroccan, Ghanaian, and South Asian Surinamese, they had weaker associations with depression or depressed mood. And when you come to the third model, the associations are you could almost say for these people, there's no association. Then the stars on my model indicate how different these ethnic groups are in relation to the Dutch population. So with 2 stars being a significance of 0.01. So we can see then on the final waist circumference model here, this South Asian Surinamese group is highly different from the Dutch above. And then if we look at subsequent models, we can see that adding lifestyle factors doesn't seem to make much difference to the relationships, whereas when you add chronic diseases, the relationships tend to be attenuated, which suggests that part of the relationship between being obese and having depression is caused by the fact people have chronic diseases. And then if you compare the obesity model to the waist circumference one, you would say they're pretty similar, but waist circumference seems to exaggerate the differences between everyone, which also is a bit less surprising because waist circumference is a better measure of metabolic disorder. Okay, then there's one other figure, which is the same as the previous one, but this time I've done it only made it for the subset with inflammatory markers. And actually we can see the differences between the 2 models is very small. So adding inflammation to your model doesn't make any difference to the relationships. And all of the relationships are a little bit more or less significant, but that's because the numbers were a lot smaller in this analysis. So to conclude, the strength of the relationship between obesity measures and depressed mood differs for different ethnic groups, with the strongest association being among the Dutch and African Surinamese, but weaker to non-associations between South Asian Surinamese, Ghanaian, Turkish and Moroccan groups. And the differences between the groups are greater when you look at waist circumference. So the supposed mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, we think probably body dissatisfaction plays a large role in this, and also perceived weight discrimination. And this is also partly backed up by the fact that the groups that had weak associations with depression were also, the three of them, were the groups that have the largest prevalence of obesity within their populations. I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk, and I'll take any questions. Oh, and I'd also like to mention I've got a poster of this downstairs as well, and a poster on another project within the MooDFOOD project. So if you want more information, you can look at the poster too.
Got any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Andy Hill from Leeds in the UK. Are there cultural differences in the presentation of depression? And if so, does this have any impacts on your analysis?
Sorry, are there
cultural differences in the presentation of depression?
Apart from the prevalence of depression, I don't know. It was only, I haven't examined the individual items of the questionnaire to know what things made up their depression. And it's also, unfortunately, that's the sort of downside. We only have a self-reported questionnaire on depressive symptoms, whereas in the Nesta study that Nadine worked on and I previously worked on, we actually have clinical depression with much more items. So as far as I know, no, there aren't differences, but we don't really have enough information to analyse it.
It's just worth checking on the background literature. There are large cultural differences in the presentation of symptoms of other mental health disorders, and it would surprise me if there weren't some subtle differences in the presentation of depression as well. And you're using PHQ-9, which is a measure really developed for white Europeans, white Americans.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions? I've got one quick question. What's similar then about the Dutch and the African Surinamese?
That's a big, I don't know.
Yeah.
And why are the African Surinamese different from the South Asian Surinamese? I think the differences compared to the Dutch are all much more logical. I don't know so very much about the African Surinamese, why they should also suffer from depression if they've got a larger figure, but not the South Asian. They're the two sort of questionable groups, because also I think the prevalence of depression, obesity was higher in one of them too. So it's a bit of a mystery. I'll have to do a bit more historical research, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay.